Welcome everybody to day 4 of the Hippodrome Silent Film Festival online edition and to our third live Q&A event, this time after the wonderful streaming of Prix De Beauté with Stephen Horne's wonderful score. I'm just going to start off with a little bit of housekeeping. This Q&A, we've got 45 minutes. It's going to go by in a flash, but after the 45 minutes, we can maybe move on to the Facebook hub for more chat. It's being recorded. Everybody who is in the audience, everybody, you've got your cameras turned off. I won't be able to see you raising a hand, but if you'd like to ask a question, there's the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So you can pop your questions in there, and I'll be keeping an eye on that Q&A box. You see we've got our wonderful British Sign Language interpreter, Greg, and we've also got some live captioning. There's a little bit of a delay with them joining this session, but I'm hoping if the captions haven't started yet, they'll be starting very soon. And if you'd like to make use of the captions, there's a box at the bottom of your screen that you can click on. Live transcript is a little icon CC, and you can choose whether to have captions or the full transcript. And so now I'd like to invite our special guests to turn their cameras on, please. So we have welcome to Stephen Horne and welcome to Pamela Hutchinson. So good to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Stephen Horne, silent film accompanist extraordinaire, plays internationally at the most prestigious film festivals around the world, and frequent winner of the Silent London annual poll of best solo accompanist and best performance. And the Silent London poll is, of course, run by Mrs. Silent London, Pamela Hutchinson, who is a freelance writer, critic, and film historian. And her many publications include the BFI Film Classic, now in its second edition, on Pandora's Box, starring Louise Brooks, and so obviously our first choice as our guest speaker on this Q&A. Thank you both so much. I would like to, everyone who's coming here to this Q&A, I'm hoping will have come straight from viewing the film and is going to feel quite wrung out by the ending. I think we should dive in and talk straight away and talk about the ending of the film. I'm not sure if everybody saw that piece that you recorded for camera on the hub, but Stephen, but you do make mention of the particular problem posed to musicians by the ending. So would you tell us a bit more about that and how you sought to solve that?
Yeah, well, I have a long, strange relationship with the film. I was first booked to accompany it in Bristol, 2006, I believe, by the company was Bristol Silence at the time. And I was booked to accompany it, but they couldn't provide me with a screener of the silent version. So they sent me a DVD of the sound version. And that was the first thing I saw. And then in between, before I got to accompany it, I saw the silent version at the Pordenone Silent Film Festival. So it was quite a strange way to see it. And when I saw the silent version, I much preferred it, but the final scene seemed very strange because I'd seen the sound version, and that final scene is so much about the song and hearing Louise's voice, the female voice at the end. So I thought, well, I could just try and play melody on the piano, but then I'll have been playing piano for 2 hours before then. So I just had the idea. What I did was I played the DVD, and it was a dictaphone. This is 2006. So I had a dictaphone and recorded the final song and then played that live, actually hit play on my dictaphone in the Bristol screening. But the other question was, having made that decision, do I play the whole song? Because it's like a 3-minute sequence. That wasn't possible because the speeds are different. The sound version runs faster than the silent, so it would be wildly out of sync by the end. And so then I thought, well, actually, there would be something quite poetic about having it just bursting out when she's killed. So it was a technical question that led to an almost philosophical solution, which was you'll hear the song on the piano, as it was then, now piano and flute, in the first 2 minutes of the film. And then when she's shot, it's like silent film, Louise dies, and we see sound film Louise on the screen, and voice comes out. So like death releases voice. So that's, it was very rough and ready then, but I've done it several times since. And what made the difference was when I played it in San Francisco at the Silent Film Festival. Their resident sound genius, Gary Hobish, made a sound file. And because it's still not the same speed, he stretched it so that it more perfectly syncs with the speed of the silent version. And so the other live shows I've done since then, I've been sitting there with my laptop open for the whole film with this little MP3, waiting to sort of hit play in exactly the right moment and patching it through the cinema's PA. So that's another nice thing when it's live, is you've got the sort of localized piano sound in a corner of the room. And then if I get it right, the voice will come through the cinema sound system for the final minute.
It was phenomenal, and I can honestly say it's one of the most memorable moments of any accompaniment that I've experienced. And Pamela, you'll have considered the ending of the film and seen it lots of times. So tell us what the ending, your response to Stephen's response, and also any thoughts that you have about the way the film ends generally.
It's one of the all-time endings actually in film, and it's very complex to achieve it, and we'll talk about it later, but for an early sound film to use an ending that revolves around sound in such a complex way is quite ambitious. It was the invention of the French director René Clair, who worked on the film originally, and as a film historian, or just someone who likes old films, it's really tempting to look at this and say this is the death of the silent Louise Brooks, because this is her final silent film as well as her first talkie, and she goes into a new phase of her career now. I mean, for Louise Brooks, silent film is everything. If you want to look at her career, those are the films you need to watch, her silent films. It's interesting to think about it in the way that her sort of mentor, G.W. Pabst, who directed Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl, would have thought of it. He thought that she was this wonderful actress who really sort of embodied something intensely cinematic. So to have her sort of dying in real life and living on screen would be very meaningful for him. And I think that these meanings are so powerful to us now. Sometimes it's interesting to sit back and remember that within the film, it's simply narratively a great tragic ending when she's singing in French, and this is obviously dubbed, she didn't sing at all. She's singing and she's saying, "Don't be jealous, be quiet. I have only one love, and it's you." And I think that, yeah, I know, that's the only response. It's a really powerful ending. It's clever in the way that it's shot as well. It's hard to capture people in real life and on a screen at the same time. It is something that was meticulously planned and boarded by Claire, and Janina, who happened to be a very talented director, but was perhaps more comfortable in more naturalistic scenes, has accomplished beautifully. And he felt that the ending was the most important thing about the film.
Huh. It's so interesting how the meaning of the film has sort of accumulated and grown after the film's first release, and about Louise Brooks herself. And I'd like to hear from both of you about her. And I think Stephen as well, you said you had a particular response to Louise Brooks as an accompanist.
Yeah, well, I had a slightly borderline ghostly experience, like really early on in my silent film career. So we're talking something like 30 years ago, ridiculously. and it was Louise Brooks, but I assume it was probably Pandora's Box. I don't really remember, but I was accompanying it live, and I think I hadn't seen the film before, so I was doing it blind, and I think it was NFT2, so I was like right below the screen and looking up, and there was this big close up of Louise Brooks, and I was, in the moment with the music and everything, and just for a moment, sometimes you can lip read silent film stars, and that's essentially what I was doing. But in my mind, I thought I heard her voice saying the words. So obviously, I was just reading the words, but something about seeing that and then playing music, it seemed like a voice was in my head. So since then, I've always thought of silent films as a bit of a haunting experience.
She has such a presence on the screen, doesn't she? And I really enjoy. She's so wonderful to watch in this film, and and very naturalistic and very winning personality in the film. And I love particularly the scenes in the train carriage when she's traveling to the pageant in the first place, and all that delight that she takes in all the little details in the carriage. And it's so hard for us to understand now why this was Louise Brooks' final starring role. So Pamela, could you tell us a bit more about that? How did it come?
There's a short answer to that, and that's because Louise Brooks was trouble, really, and she knew better than everyone else, and she really did. She was a fantastic talent. So she was a young woman from Kansas who trained as a dancer early on, and so she worked at first in modern dance and then in things a little bit more better paid and risque, like the Ziegfeld Follies, and that's what she was doing when she first got into cinema. And she has this wonderful combination of being dance trained, so she moves very naturally, and so she controls her body perfectly, and she was a very physical and hedonistic person. So when you say she can convey something like delight in luxury, delight in sex, quite often you see that quite a lot, and delight in just beauty, the way she gets so visibly excited by clothes in her films is really lovely. But she was fiercely intelligent, and so whatever she's doing, she's also really giving you that inner performance, the sort of interiority that people don't expect to get from silent film. And I think that when you watch a silent film, there's always this element of a sort of third space that I think Stephen was talking about. There's action on screen and there's the viewer, and because there isn't that prosaic communication of words, of spoken language, you make something in the middle. You come to rise up to meet the film, and with a performer of the intelligence and charisma and beauty of Louise Brooks, that connection can be so immediate. Like many people, the first time I watched Pandora's Box, I thought, this is wonderful and she's wonderful. Remind me what happened again? Because you just sort of enjoy being with her and seeing her act. And when she's on camera in this film and in many of her other great silents, her presence can seem somehow, well, it's definitely enchanting, but somehow empowering as well. She feels like a liberated figure, even though the films themselves often paint her into narrative corners. The presence of Louise Brooks in our life makes our lives better.
I love that. The presence of Louise Brooks makes our lives better. I'm just going to refer to some of the questions that are sitting here in the Q&A box, if that's okay. This one from Vicky Gowan says she loves the music. This is a general question, I think, wondering what percentage of films were still silent in 1930? When did silent films completely stop being made? And were there different rules? This is another separate... There's lots of questions in here, Vicky. I'm just going to pick out we can pick up some of these later, but yes. So were both being made at the same time, silent and sound? Pamela, maybe?
So people remember the jazz singer from 1927, autumn of 1927. I think I might have said 77, sorry, 27, being like the talkie that ushered in the talkie revolution. It took the industry a bit of time to follow. So we're looking at the transition to talkies in America in 1928, and about a year later in Europe, really. This film was made at a time where people would be wanting to make sound films, but they were making films that were sort of almost sound films a lot of the time. This film was shot mostly as a silent and was released as a silent as well as a sound film. but the sound in it was sort of intermittent, a bit of dialogue, a few audio effects. It is, you can tell that it's quite early because it would have been René Clair's first sound film. And in fact, actually, René Clair, Dieter Pabst and Augusto Giannina had all travelled to England to learn about sound film techniques. So the people that made this film were experimenting. So you would be expecting to watch a sound film in 1930, but what you would be watching would be the first sound films, which technically weren't always very successful. René Clair's Under the Roofs of Paris is known to be one of the sort of the great films that hits it right out of the gate. It uses sound in interesting ways. At the time that Prix De Beauté came out, the critics said it didn't work sound-wise. And that's one of the reasons why it wasn't popular. People wanted to go and see accomplished sound films because that was the new craze. Of course, now we get to watch it as a silent and realize that on those terms, it's a beautiful film.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to look for as another question here. This one is very from Shawnetta. I couldn't help noticing the number of times a megaphone/speaker was visually shown. Was this intentional? Or was it meant to signify something else? Mm-hmm. That's the first part of that question. So that's interesting about, and I think also there's a lot of there's the interest in the shots of the printing equipment and the machinery and the trains as well. So and it'd be interesting as well to hear, Stephen, how you approach those musically. But maybe Pamela, what do you think about this noticing of the megaphones?
It's a really good point, and it's completely on the money. Absolutely. I mean, silent films convey things by imagery rather than sound is a really obvious point to make, but that means that often they want to tell you that a scene is noisy or there's loudness, but they will show you the physical source of the sound. And I think in this film it also has a kind of symbolic it's foreshadowing of the end of the film. And so you see I think you see a record player on the beach in the very first minutes of the film, and just carries on. She's listening to music. Music itself sort of is a good stand-in for someone, wanting to sing, to express themselves, to live a bigger life, and that's true there. So yeah, I think that's completely intentional, but I'd love to know how Stephen feels when he sees some mechanical sound on screen.
Oh, well, I like the challenge. Weirdly enough, the absolute worst thing for me is when you see a piano in the scene. You're playing on the piano and then suddenly someone plays the piano. That's like, how do you signal this? But I'm not quite sure with this particular film. You're right. In some silent films, you'll have a close up on a gramophone, whatever, as a sort of signal that you would be hearing something, and possibly also a signal to the musician. Directors would know that their films would be accompanied. I sometimes feel as though, when I'm accompanying a film, it's like the director saying, "You out there, I want you to play something at this moment that sounds equivalent." But with this film, I wonder if when you see the sound version and you get the kind of close-ups of megaphones, you hear a sort of on the soundtrack. So I'm not sure if it's there as a cue to the musician or whether it's actually just literally there as a sound effect within the sound version. Because it was it's strange period of time. You would sometimes get films that had two very separate versions, and other times you would get essentially a sound film that would be sent out for cinemas that didn't. If they were sent out to cinemas that didn't yet have the equipment, then they would send a silent version with a music track and things like that. So I sort of approach those particular things as though I would if it were purely a silent film, but I don't try and play an equivalent effect to a megaphone going off.
There's a tango, isn't there? So is that something you'd research and find the?
Yes, actually, that is also there's two tunes that are taken from this sound version. There's the principal song, which I use as a melody throughout the whole film, and the tango, which the the melody I play is also what you hear if you watch the sound version.
Mm-hmm.
And that was provided for me by Thomas from the Louise Brooks Society. He found that, the sheet music.
And there's another part to Shaunetta's question here, which is, was there any fallout / criticism of Ms. Brooks representing Miss France, Miss Europe? And I think that's something we were talking about before we came into the Q&A about the gender politics of the film. And I hadn't realized until I looked into it that beauty pageants were quite a new phenomenon, really. But I'm not sure if that's what's behind Shaunetta's question, but the question was specifically, was there any criticism for portraying Miss France?
I don't think that happened, actually. What happened when she went to Berlin to make Pandora's Box is that she was sort of welcomed and it was trumpeted that how wonderful an American star is going to star in our great German classic, and then basically people didn't like the film, so that wasn't very nice for her at all. But despite that having happened, obviously Pandora's Box was released in France. When she arrived in Paris to make this film, everyone was absolutely thrilled, and she just discovered that, you know, Louise Brooks herself was a trend in Paris, and when she arrived she saw that you know, that people were very keen to see her, and that the Louise Brooks haircut was considered incredibly chic, and lots of Parisian ladies were trying to look like her. So I don't think she discovered any fallout on that regard. I think the film sort of rather disappeared and she ran off to America again, which she tended to do between each film, run away and hide in New York.
Thank you for answering that one. This is a comment, actually. It says, your intro made me cry, Pamela, and your music was magical, Stephen, which is very nice comment there. And there was another part of Vicky's question at the beginning, which was if there are different rules in different countries for what was allowed to be shown on screen in 1930, and were studios in Europe more liberal than they were in the United States?
I mean, this is quite a complicated time, actually. So in the silent era in America, the studios sort of had a kind of mutual code of assurance that there were certain things they wouldn't do. And that sort of slipped in the early 30s, and the censorship code and the censors officially really started clamping down in 1935. So things were getting a little wild in America. In Europe, everything had always been a little bit more liberal, you know, and if you want to watch European films from the late 20s, you'll see lots of decadence and sin, but there were still things that they found quite shocking. I don't think there's anything too much in this film that they would have found too outrageous, but you know,
there's legs.
There's legs. You know, I think that people like to look at legs. I think, you know, you talked about the gender politics and beauty pageants. You know, yes, it is quite a flagrant display, isn't it? And I think it's shown to be quite a flagrant display. The film is interesting when it comes to its attitude towards beauty pageants, and it really talks about this. I like the way you pointed out the pun in the title, that Lucienne gets so many opportunities in life from not just working in an office and sort of clanging away as a mechanical worker, almost as a typist, but by being sort of prized for her beauty. But of course, she is fully objectified by this, you know, and we see this particular tragic arc that happens to her in her life, but you can tell that, you know, she does become objectified by the men around her. And this is a theme that recurs in the films. That
I love that way that's foregrounded at the beginning when she's getting changed in the car, and that is forcing you through that frame that he's peeping through.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there you see the sort of voyeur's eye view, as we sort of always taught to think about cinema and the male gaze. But actually, I think you instantly see how self-conscious it is and think, why is he gawping at her? And of course, she starts, you know, teasing people and getting her own back straight away.
Interestingly, also her character is judged, isn't she, by Andre, by her boyfriend, who takes the very sort of moralistic anti-beauty pageant stance at the beginning.
It's a sort of double standard, the sexual double standard, isn't it? You know, obviously he likes looking at legs, but the idea that his girlfriend's legs should be looked at by anyone else is, and that's really the trap, you know, that's the price of beauty in many ways. Pabst was obsessed with getting Louise Brooks into these roles where he would show that her life as a beautiful and free-spirited young woman would ultimately lead to tragedy. And she slightly resisted it, but she liked working with him. And, you know, getting her involved in this film was very much Pab's idea. It's exactly the kind of thing, the kind of story that he saw for her, sort of tragic endings of a beautiful woman who was too alive to live.
That final shot of Andre as well is really weird, isn't it? Because he's looking at her dying. He's like radiant with love.
Yeah,
it's like so weird.
He's finally contained her, hasn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, you see a lot of the famous shots in the film of her with the birdcage, and you know, it's very clearly, especially to a sort of modern and feminist or post-feminist perspective, very clearly saying something about the role of women, and yet it's all done in this very naturalistic style. So it almost, you just absorb these things without it being a kind of didactic film. And Janina was really fond of androgynous, free-spirited heroines. Like the women in his films do sort of push the boundaries of what is acceptable for a demure young woman. They are street kids, basically.
I love the way that you manage, maybe it's with your music, Stephen, or the film, or the way they work together we don't hold it's not caricatured, the two polar positions, like the constraining boyfriend. You do still have a bit of sympathy for him, I think, and, you know, especially maybe when you see him huddled on the train when she finds him there. But I'm interested in that way that the music, this is what the whole festival's about in many ways, how the music tells the story of the film, and the way that I think earlier somebody mentioned, maybe Pamela, about foreknowledge. And there's many examples, but there was one when she's on the train heading out to the pageant, and we're introduced for the first time to Grabowski, and there's his gloved hands appears, and you have a very subtly a very low chord. And I just wondered about how you calibrate your foreknowledge of a film and your own response with that of the audience, because that's you telling us perhaps something. But
yeah, I mean, it's a free floating thing. There's, I take it scene by scene. Also, musicians of my generation started accompanying silence usually without the benefit of seeing the films beforehand. It was just the way it was done in those days. So I got quite used to accompanying films blind, where that kind of foreshadowing wouldn't be possible unless you were literally telepathic. And that has a different quality, which is sort of quite nice in a way. That kind of instantaneous reaction can be, there's a certain energy that you can get from that. But if you have seen the film before, and in this case several times, then it would be a bit strange not to use that knowledge musically. So without sort of, I tried to do a little bit of that without it being like playing the theme from Jaws, you know. This guy's a villain, you know. Just try and hit a sort of a little suggestion of it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it works really well. There's a question that's come in via Facebook. Jessica asks Pamela if all the actors were speaking their mother tongues, and if the director could talk during the action to get the actors, for example, to heighten their emotions. So okay, so this was shot with some silent scenes where that wouldn't have been where that would have been possible, obviously, but there were dialogue scenes, and it was dubbed, it was released in French, German, Italian, and English. I mean, so in this case, you didn't have to make multiple copies of it. I'm not entirely sure how they achieved it. I think they might have shot it all silent and then dubbed it afterwards, but that would seem easier. There's obviously not you know, that would have been simpler for them in the studio. But yeah, you do expect silent actors to be coached live through their scenes. And of course, we have someone like Louise Brooks. She didn't speak French, and she certainly didn't speak Italian or German, or, well, she just spoke American in a very strange accent. So, you know, the way she would be coaxed would be more physical, perhaps. And the cinematographer, in fact, would sometimes interpret
for her, because there was an official interpreter on set, but he often got a little bit lost in translation with things that said. The Rudolph Malte, the cinematographer, he would say things in a much more polite way, because the only way to get Louise Brooks to do anything is really to coax her and flatter her. That's
So can you tell, so you said, so Pabst was presumably speaking in German to her then, was when he worked with her? And
Pabst spoke quite a lot of languages, so I think he would probably have been able to speak to her in English, but Louise Brooks was just not comunicado for most people, and that was just the way she liked it, I think. She was very young. She was so young when she was making these films. She was in her very early 20s, and I think that people sort of forget, because the roles are so sophisticated and films are quite sophisticated, that she was a very young girl far away from home, and she wasn't necessarily taking it as seriously as perhaps you might expect someone to do if they had this opportunity to make art films in Europe that were going to be seen and adored by the critics, because they were made by these great directors who were already incredibly lauded. She wasn't conscious of what she was contributing to, I think.
But so you say in the program notes that she loved to work with Pabst, and one of these great directors, and that she only came for him. Can you tell us a bit more about that relationship?
Yeah, so she loved to work for him. I mean, she didn't really love to work. So loving to work for Pabst it should be taken within those boundaries. They had a quite love-hate relationship. She thought that he was a genius. She thought that she could thrive under his direction, but he occasionally did bully her into actions on set, and she would throw a tantrum at him. She would throw a tantrum at anyone, but she got on better working with him than she did the people in America who perhaps she felt were less her intellectual equal, is one way to put it. She was a woman who really loved her freedom. And so this is where their relationship got difficult, because G.W. Pabst thought that he had found this fantastic actress, and he'd tried to have a protege before, like the sort of ahistorical model would be Joseph von Sternberg and Marlene Dietrich. We'll see her before that happened later. But he wanted to have this protege, and he thought he'd found it with Brigitte Helm, but he was effectively banned from working with her after he put her in what the studio thought was a dirty movie. So he was looking for someone else, and he thought that Louise Brooks would be the actress via which he could express everything he wanted to say about women in society and love and sex and passion. And although she liked working for him, she didn't like the idea that she was going to be at someone's sort of command in that way. And she didn't like being told what to do. And he would constantly tell her, you're going to end up like one of the characters in these films. You're going to come to a bad end. You've got to stop going out partying. You've got to take this seriously. And she did not like that at all, unfortunately. So she sort of ran away from him and then ran back to him in the way that, it's very Burton and Taylor, but all to do with filmmaking.
There's another question here in the chat. This is from James Curran. How common was it for American silent stars to go and work in Europe? Or I suppose another way to ask this is, were European studios and directors resistant to this? Or did they want to get American actors to come over?
It wasn't, an everyday occurrence, but it happened quite a lot, because in the silent era, obviously there's no language barrier for what people see on screen. And I think one of the earlier questions was about things that were allowed in Europe. So for example, the classic example of an American star who went to Europe and made wonderful films, much better films than she would have been allowed to make in Hollywood, is Anna May Wong, the Chinese American actress, because in American cinema, it would have been unthinkable for a non-white actor and a white actor to share a kiss and be the romantic leads in a film, which is obviously a terrible, outdated racist attitude. But in Europe, that wasn't a consideration. And so Anna May Wong is one of the many people who came to Europe for that reason, to be the leading lady. And you see her in films like Piccadilly and some German films. You will see that her characters are a little bit constrained by stereotypes also. It was generally considered that the money was in Hollywood. To be blunt, the art was in Europe. It's not entirely fair. So American studios were very keen to buy up European talent as soon as they could. That was the direction of travel mostly. Ever since Polo Negri and Ernst Lubitsch went over, many people followed for the money, but a few people went the other way.
Thank you for answering that. Here's a question, this time is for Stephen. He says, this is from John. How do you decide on music choices, particularly for the larger street crowd scenes? And just to say that that's one of the things I really enjoyed about the film is those wonderful scenes of real life. To what level do you draw on pieces from a classical catalogue, for example, or do you not do this? And so he's asking, do you have go-to pieces? And if you play the same film on more than one occasion, does the music change, or are you quite strict with repeating what you've done before?
Well, again, there's no absolute choice, and it varies from film to film. But it's always, I generally use my own music, although I have a classical training, so I probably unconsciously draw on certain genres and pieces that I've heard in the past. But it depends. Some films like this one I've done numerous times, and so I've started from a point of view of total improvisation until I get to the point of this recording where it's virtually a composition, and sort of themes will crop up that seem right for that film, and so I might start to repeat them in subsequent screenings. But when I accompany them live, unless it's a fully notated score, there will always be a large element of improvisation. And also, in the case of what you heard today, that's a recording, so I did things that I literally couldn't do live.
You don't have to tell people.
No.
I'm teasing.
Well, I kind of draw attention to it. This is the one time I think when I've actually almost deliberately drawn attention to the studio, because there's a few scenes where there's an actual unapologetic effect, like at the end, where it's cutting backwards and forwards between the studio with the sound test and Andre kind of making his way up to the studio, and we used a sort of a very deliberate sort of changing of, I would do that live by just changing the volume, but we could put a kind of muted effect onto the music when he's outside the door, and I think that's probably audible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think we've got a few more minutes left here to talk, which is great. One of the things that I wanted to draw out, maybe Pamela, you could, about how the class is drawn out in the film, because I think it's quite an achievement really that we don't take against the Lucienne character, because she doesn't come over as a snob. But yet, but she's clearly, like in the scene in the fairground when there's all the people around her and she's horrified by them, and yet we still sympathize with her. We never lose that. But could you tease that out a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said before, this is about a story of a woman who realizes how much larger her world could be. She has this situation, she has, what a person is meant to have, fiance and a home, a job, and, wife and motherhood beckons. And she is a woman who's not satisfied with that. And when she realizes that she has opportunities, I think a lot of it helps with Brooks's performance, because we can see how she chases that, because that's a feeling that she felt herself. It's interesting in a way that one of the things the film is saying is that it's sort of the upper class characters who make working class people feel dissatisfied with their lot. If you've never had a fur coat, then you won't miss one, kind of thing. But actually, there's a whole rule to the world that she's about to enter. There's lots of rules that she doesn't quite understand, and she wouldn't be expected to understand. And she gets put into a position where she's sort of further and further trapped until she's literally trapped on film. I mean, that's kind of, it's a very clear visual narrative in the film, and it's also quite interesting, another level stylistically in the film. Those street scenes, like in the fair and like the opening at the beach and so on, the street scenes do remind people very often of those city symphonies and those films that were just about the city, about the rush of modernity, about people, about working people. And so you sort of do see this. It's like the characters in Shakespeare, where, you know, upper class characters speak in blank verse and lower class characters speak in prose, because you have a kind of almost documentary style for one level of characters, the crowds at the beauty pageant, another example, and then you have more formal stage narrative scenes when she enters a different world. And so it's very easy for you to sort of see at every level of performance and cinematography, and the cinematography in this film is stunning, the changes in the world that she goes through. And I think that it's a film that maybe sometimes for people seems a little bit drawn out. It's quite some lengthy sequences, but it is absolutely at every scene a sort of mini masterpiece, and I think it's a wonderful underseen film. That's just my feeling. I got very excited about the film today watching it.
That's so interesting what you say there about the way the different classes are filmed and because it does have that very kind of I can't think of the sort of interior sort of fake Fred Astaire and Rogers interiors where the prince is stalking around behind the
big white
shrubbery.
set. The big white set. Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. We are pretty much at the end of our time, but I did want to say, massive thank you to both of you for drawing out even more pleasure and enjoyment and understanding, not only in your program notes and your introduction and your music, but also in this discussion now. There's just a little thing I did want to tell everybody, that Stephen is one of those really admirable, slightly annoying people that's been very productive in lockdown and has produced an album called Silent Sirens. That's right, isn't it, Stephen?
Yep.
It's an album of piano pieces by Stephen Horne and inspired by the heroines of silent film. So I think, does the music from this appear anywhere in that album?
Not the score as it's finally been recorded, but there are themes across the pieces that have been associated with Louise Brooks, in my mind at least, over the years.
Well, so seek that out, people. And the first single, Beyond the Trees, was released yesterday. Is that right? Yesterday. So there you go. And also, just please do join us. I'm very pleased that Stephen and Pamela have agreed to head back over to the Facebook hub. So if you've got any more questions, or if you've got any more comments about what we've all just been discussing, please go there, and hopefully they'll be around to pick up some of those. And then join us tonight, please, for The Woman Men Yearn For, with a score by Frame Ensemble, and the intro for that is at 7 o'clock local time, Scottish time. The film is at 7:10, and then there's the live Q&A at 8:45. But that's us finished for now. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.